Welcome to SuperCrowd Chicago, live in person at Columbia College Chicago and streaming live internationally on the E360 TV network and across social media.
With that, I'm excited to introduce the kickoff speaker for our closing session, a dear friend of mine, and you're the only one besides me, right, that's been to all of these, right? Am I right? Did Bill go to all of them? No.
Utah.
Not Utah. Yeah. I think you're the only one. You
little patch, right?
Yeah, you got to get an award. So we did SuperCrowd Utah. Brian was there. We did SuperCrowd Baltimore. Brian was there. SuperCrowd Chicago. Brian is here. Brian is the CEO of Brainsy. He leads the pioneering AI-powered social media platform that rewards engagement. He's an advisor in crowdfund holdings innovators and the 2024 president of the Crowdfunding Professional Association, champions innovation that level the economic playing field. Brian holds a BA from Miami University and an MBA from Georgetown University. And I mentioned the CFPA president thing. He is a rock star and a brainiac and a dear friend. Brian, take it away.
So it's a real honor to be here. Thank you, Devin. I think it's great that you're doing this, arranging these pop-up series that's going around city to city, give people a chance to really learn more about regulated investment crowdfunding. Had a number of people ask me, why aren't younger people more involved? Why aren't more people aware of this? Part of this because there aren't more people like Devin who are out doing this type of thing to really spread the word about regulated investment crowdfunding. We've had a great chance to hear about people who are operationally involved with regulated investment crowdfunding. And my role, the hat I wear as head of CFPA this year, I get a chance to talk about some of the trends, some of the sort of future things that are happening in the space of crowdfunding. So today I'm going to talk about stakeholder equity and how that could be the next big thing for regulated investment crowdfunding. First, let's talk a little bit about definitions. We'll just do some building blocks here. And let's talk about the difference between shareholders and stakeholders. So shareholders are by definition a form of stakeholder, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. So stakeholders are those who have an interest in the company at some level that doesn't necessarily have to be directly tied to the capital appreciation. So that's community, that's vendors, that's employees, that is just really the whole ecosystem of people who are involved with a particular company. Stakeholders, it's a much broader definition as people have an interest. Now, the reason why it's important to differentiate this is because shareholders for many years have been considered sort of the king as it relates to the corporations. And a lot of this started with a paper that was written and published in the New York Times by Milton Friedman. The paper was titled "The Social Responsibility of Business to Increase Its Profits." Now, it's important for us to take a look at this historically because he really set the tone for this primacy, this concept of shareholder primacy through the 70s, through the 80s, and it's affected regulation, it's affected business practices, it's affected legal. This has really been something that's shaped a lot of American corporate landscape. And that is that the shareholder and the responsibility is all about profit maximization. Now, there's a fundamental flaw in that, and that is if you think about, it's like, well, on what scale? In 1 day, 1 month? Are we talking about 10 years? Because when you start thinking about profit maximization, you're talking about extracting profits to the shareholders. You start playing with the concept of sustainability because if you extract a lot, you lose potential sustainability. So there has been a lot of recent pushback, but for decades, this has been what's dominated the American mindset of corporations. It's also paved the way for private equity. So today you'll see there's about 4,500 private equity firms in the US. And you talk about the concept and the principles that are really applied by private equity firms. It is, how do we extract as much value as possible from the companies we invest in? It's not about value creation. It's about value extraction. And that's started as LBOs, it's moved to private equities, but it's perfectly acceptable for people in their industry to focus on value extraction using private equity as sort of the mechanism, the tool to do so. And the private equity playbook is a predictable one. Basically, private equity firms will aggregate funds from LPs, which can be pension funds, insurance, family offices. They'll use that. They often leverage that up with bank loans and other forms of capital, and they'll go and they'll acquire a company with cash flow, with revenue. They'll take it over, and they'll use that to pay off the existing shareholders, and then they'll start their game of extraction, one way or the other. And so there's a book that's been written that's getting a lot of attention by Brendan Ballou, and he's quoted as saying, private equity is like the 1970s Ford Pinto. Not every one of the Pintos need to explode for it to be unsafe at any speed. It's inherent the design of the car that it becomes dangerous. I think that's a very appropriate analogy. I think others are seeing that as an appropriate analogy. And if we look at some examples, some of the results of what's happening when companies are acquired by private equity, we start to see some patterns. So recently, the Harvard Business School, some researchers there did a meticulous study to look at private equity-owned hospitals versus non-private equity hospitals. And the patient outcomes are much worse for those that are private equity-owned. And people are sicker longer. There's just all sorts of indicators. And so this was pretty shocking to a lot of people, but not surprising to many of us. There's a well-known case study of the Carlyle Group acquiring Manor Care, which was a nursing home, and they just ran it in the ground. And there's a lot of sort of interesting things and takeaway about the ways they did that. But because it's so well known now that when private equity firms take over a nursing home facility, that there will be deaths that follow. There's a whole cottage industry of lawyers now who are publishing things like this, who follows around. They say, look, private equity firms buy nursing homes, residents die. The ambulance chasers are there to sort of help some of the families to put a check on those private equity, because people realize that's sort of one of the outcomes that's happening. A lot of debt gets saddled into these companies. They're not sustainable. It's used to pay off the existing ownership. So it's not used to sort of reinvest in the business oftentimes. So this is something else that's become apparent with private equity. There's fee extraction that takes place, whereas the private equity firms pay themselves tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars out of the revenue stream of the company for the advice they provide. And there's cost cutting. We all read about cost cutting that takes place, where if your measure is how profitable, well, sometimes people get in the way of that. And so the measure of success is not about sustainability. It's about the cash you can extract. Oftentimes, private equity firms will do a lot of cost cutting before they sell the firm to another private equity, the company to another private equity firm. And then there's this practice that you may have heard called dividend recapitalization. And this is particularly pernicious, where they will have a company issue a lot of debt and then pay it out as a dividend to all the private equity owners without changing the cap table at all. It's just basically a chance to extract money. And this, what we've seen post-pandemic, this was a strategy that was being used quite frequently during the pandemic when the IPO market wasn't operating so much. Okay, let's get our money out. And now a lot of the debt of those companies is being downgraded because they're realizing it's not sustainable debt on those companies. And then this fact is really important to note. Companies that are purchased by a private equity firm are 10 times more likely to go bankrupt than their peers. It's pretty damning. So what's the alternative? Well, an alternative is actually something called stakeholder equity. And that's where we're really valuing not just the shareholders. Shareholders are important. But we're saying employees, customers, communities, the planet. It all has to work together in order for the company, the corporation to be sustainable. And there are this is not just a sort of a hippie sort of thought process. The Business Roundtable in 2019 actually came and they issued a statement that said, this whole concept of shareholder primacy that we all thought was so important for so many years, we're actually going to look at the importance of stakeholders. And 181 CEOs signed off on that. I think there's only 9 who didn't. Business Roundtable is a pretty conservative organization. And even they have come a long way and started to realize that this importance of stakeholders is really critical. It's not just about shareholders anymore. Key takeaway, shareholders, equity, very different than private equity, okay? So this is sort of one path to talk about. Now let's talk about crowdfunding. And so the Jobs Act really focused on jumpstart our business startups. We all know that that's been a big focus of, and we talked to many startups who are utilizing the Jobs Act, but it's not just for startups. A little history for those of you who may be unfamiliar: signed into law in 2012. The rulemaking took place in 2016, so it made it feasible. And then in 2021, the CFPA, among others, advocated for an increase in the limits that could be utilized. Under Reg CF, a company can raise up to $5 million a year. Under Regulation A, up to $75 million a year. Those limits were raised in 2021. And recently, the House passed a bill which basically said that $75 million under Regulation A, it should be $150 million. So the Senate hasn't passed it yet, but the trend is that those numbers could actually go up. Now, we talked a little bit, and we talk a lot about startups utilizing crowdfunding. But there's a challenge with startups using crowdfunding. First is, in order to acquire customers, you have to spend money. In order to acquire investors, you have to spend money. A lot of startups don't have money to do that. And so what we've seen is that in the first couple of years of crowdfunding, of regulation investment crowdfunding, 70% or more of the businesses were startups. What we're seeing happen now is it's about 50-50. About 50% of the companies using regulated investment crowdfunding are actually established companies. Well, why? Well, A, they probably have a customer base they can go to, is one explanation. Two, they have cash, which they can use to acquire other investors. And that sort of perfect place to be, which a number of people have talked about, is if your customers are also your investors, you have these sort of investimers. This is sort of what people call it. So moving toward the future, I believe that a lot more of these deals that are done under crowdfunding are going to be from existing companies, whether it's expansion or they're doing whatever reason or their motivation, they have the cash actually to run the campaigns to do that. Now, what does that mean as it relates to what we talked about for stakeholder equity? It means that we can start looking at the private equity model and their playbook for coming in and acquiring companies and saying, hey, let's have stakeholder equity firms come in and do the same thing. But instead of loading the company up with debt, why don't we raise the money from the crowd? Or instead of taking the equity component from some sort of limited partner, which may be a pension fund, why not make that an employee share ownership program? There are different ways you can start to structure the cap table, and investment crowdfunding is a really good opportunity here to start introducing those principles. And why is that possible? Well, one of our former colleagues from the CFPA sort of coined the phrase and was very well known for saying customers have more money than VCs. And change the word VCs for investors, it's true. The customers have more money than your investors. That's what makes it all financially feasible. So why not go to your customers first if you're a company that can? As we look at this, we have to start thinking about what the potential targets are. And one particular area that's really interesting that hasn't gotten attention is in this area of divestitures. A lot of corporations or others may say, hey, we've got a unit, a business unit that really doesn't make sense for us anymore. Let's spin it out. And a lot of private equity firms are lining up to buy those sorts of opportunities. But what if we start to look at those opportunities as opportunities for investment crowdfunding? And so if we look at the amount of economic activity that's taking place as divestitures, there's about $350 billion plus per year. Now, that's a big number. Keep that context of the amount of total investment crowdfunding that's happening today. It's about $1 billion a year. Think about the amount of money that's put into venture capital a year. It's about $175 billion, 150, 175. Not sure what it'll be this year, but it's about half the amount of money that's being deployed through divestitures. So this is a really good opportunity where you can bring and meld these two concepts together. And the average deal size of a divestiture is about 121 million, which is more than the 75 million Regulation A cap, but it's not more than the 150 where Regulation A is going to end up at some point in the future. So imagine having the whole deal financed through some sort of investment crowdfunding and not having to go to banks, not having to go to others for that at all. So mean, the basic concept is one man's trash or one person's trash can be another person's treasure. Again, investment crowdfunding could be a really interesting tool to bring to play in that. And let me just bring up an example that has not been done via crowdfunding, but it's an example of one that could have been. And that is with a company, a specialty chocolatier that was sold by Hershey's, that was purchased by Hershey's back in 2005, sold later, probably about 20 million, maybe it was 40 million by the time they sold it. But that again would have fallen within that cap of 75 million. And imagine you being at home and buying one of these chocolate bars, enjoying it, and you look on the foil, there's not a Willy Wonka thing there, but there's a QR code that you could scan, and basically it says, hey, you can invest in this company. Scan this and invest now. So consumer-based products would be really good candidates for this because they're so accessible and people have a connection with them. I love this chocolate. I'm going to buy every week. Now I'm going to invest in the company as well. So again, there's a certain profile of companies that make sense for this type of crowdfunding. And this is an area that I think as an industry and that consultants and people who are part of the ecosystem be interesting if people start to play it in this space, in these waters. And I also think that it's part of this sort of broader movement that even the conservative business titans have sort of signed up for, which is this concept of stakeholder equity. So you can go to stakeholderequity.com to see a manifesto that's been written about why stakeholder equity makes a lot of sense. I encourage people to visit it. I know my time's up. I'm in the deficit 30 seconds, but appreciate you all for having me here. So.